wasn't very intrigued, but my teacher was like so enthusiastic about it, like high school.
You're not intrigued at blowing up the houses apart?
Oh, okay, I mean, it's interesting. Just for vendetta, I wasn't super into that.
It's the most fun. Build a bonfire
True.
every year, you get fireworks.
Yeah, because our
you
teacher.
die, you put them out on top of the bonfire and burn them to death. I mean,
Our
it's
teacher.
a great piece of history.
She like took us outside and just like made this fire.
Alright, this color is not going to work. Uh-oh. Oh dear. Can you see that on the camera?
Yep.
The light off? All right, so today we're going to look at the effects of hot environments. Okay. All right, so when we're looking at performance issues in the heat, one of the things that we want to be aware of is the possibility of developing some form of heat stress. Okay, so heat stress comes about because the body is unable to dissipate the heat that we make while we're exercising. So remember that, you know, as soon as we start to exercise, we produce a lot more energy and therefore we produce a lot more heat. So if you add that to a hot environment and you're not able to dissipate that heat to release it, then we start to see rises in core temperature and we have some serious problems going on. All right, normal body temperature is 98.6. Once we get up around 105, then we're looking at a pretty dangerous situation with some serious consequences. Okay, so so we want to be able to respond to those increases in heat. So what is the body's response to try to maintain temperature within an appropriate range? So we have receptors out in the periphery and within the central nervous system that are able to monitor temperature changes in the body. Right? So how much stress I'm under is going to be a combination of factors. Right? What's the ambient temperature, and therefore what's the temperature gradient between my body and the atmosphere that I'm working in. All right? So all the time, if my average body temperature is 98.6, all the time that the ambient temperature is below 98.6, then my high-low is moving heat away from the body. Once the ambient temperature is higher than my body temperature, now I've got a problem because my high-low is going the wrong way and I'm absorbing heat rather than releasing heat. Right? So one of the reasons it's difficult, much harder, it feels much harder to exercise once the temperature's hitting 100 degrees and above in the summer here. Right? Even though the humidity is low, we've still got some issues with absorbing heat rather than releasing heat. Relative humidity. So what's the percentage of water vapor held in the air? Okay. And humidity plus ambient temperature, you'll often see, if you watch the weather report or you listen to the weather report on the radio, they mention what they call the heat stress index. The heat stress index is the relative humidity plus the ambient temperature. Okay? And so, for example, if it's 90 degrees in Port Harris, then humidity could be as low as 35%, all right? Our humidity goes even low. It goes down to like 10% at certain times of the year. Okay. So our heat stress index then is 125. If you look at Alabama, and we have 90%, so the actual temperature is the same, the relative humidity is likely to be 85% or higher, right? So now my heat stress index is 175. So even though the temperature is the same, the risk and the attention that I need to pay to hydration and things like that is considerably higher because of that humidity. Then the other stress factor is the wind speed. All right, the higher the wind speed, the more cooling effect it has. So it helps to move the immediate air next to my body that is heating up away and move cool air in. So that helps me to release more heat. All right. So decreases heat stress with the higher, cooler winds. So how do I lose and gain heat? All right, the first mechanism that's in place is convection. So air's blowing over the surface, that would move the warm air, replace it with cool air. So a fan can do that. That's why we like to have ceiling fans or fans in the room when it gets hot, right? Because that cool moving air helps. Could be a breeze. It can be water, right? So if you're warm and you get into cool water, one of the mechanisms that is cooling you down is convection, all right? Conduction, contact between two surfaces. So if I've got a warm surface plus a cold surface, so if I put an ice pack on, or if I get into a cold shower or a cold bath, then the amount of surface area, the more surface area that's touching the cooler surface, water, ice, cold floor, right? If your feet are really hot, it's nice to walk on a cold tile floor. We can release heat via conduction. If you're having to cool someone down, bath is better than a shower, but a shower is better than a fan. Okay. Radiation. So the environmental temperature being higher than the body, we said we can gain heat via radiation. The higher the altitude, the higher the radiant heat from the sun, right? And the increase in light intensity. So we mentioned the other day that the higher in altitude we go, the more risk we're at of developing a sunburn, skin cancer, all those kinds of problems. So even in the winter, if you're out and about, if you're training outside, or if you're hiking, or if you're skiing, you should be using sunscreen, right? Especially if you're skiing, because the sun bounces off the snow, and so it's very easy to get burned if you're outside. And then evaporation is our fourth mechanism. So we sweat, the water on our skin evaporates, and that helps to cool the skin. It's also why having a water spray bottle feels good, right? So it does the same thing. If I spray that water on my skin and I allow the water to evaporate, it feels cooling. Remember, if it's humid, that we don't see evaporation. Right? So the higher the humidity, the less this mechanism works, because there's already so much water vapor in the air, the water on my skin can't evaporate. So if you're working outside with your PE students or with your athletes or yourself and it's hot, what are some of the responses we're going to see to that stress of the heat on the body? So remember the whole point of responding is to try to maintain balance. Your body wants to maintain homeostasis, or as close to homeostasis as it possibly can, right? We're not very tolerant of fluctuations as humans, particularly in core body temperature, right? It's not something we deal with. You start to feel sick very quickly if your core body temperature is going up. So initially then, you're going to see increases in heart rate and cardiac output even at rest. Okay, so heart rate goes up, tries to move as much blood as possible to the skin, to the surface, so that it can try to release as much heat as it can. So even if you're sitting down, your resting heart rate may be higher than typical. So that's a sign to pay attention to, because you're quite aware if your heart rate is higher than normal. Body composition. So the larger my body mass, the greater the heat production from that mass. So someone who is tall and muscular is going to have much higher heat production and more risk of heat stress than someone who's short and lean and tiny, right? Someone who is carrying extra fat mass acts as an insulator. So my sister's always nice and cozy warm, and I'm always freezing, right? I think there's a benefit to being cozy warm, right? But it makes heat loss trickier, because you've got this layer that acts like an insulation. If it's subcutaneous fat, not visceral, then I've got this, it's like having extra blankets all the time, right? So cooling becomes harder for those individuals. Physical fitness can play a role in how susceptible I am to developing heat stress, right? The higher my fitness levels, particularly when we're looking at cardiorespiratory. So my aerobic fitness plays a really big role in how much stress the heat causes in my body, right? The higher my fitness, my aerobic fitness, the higher my cardiac output, the more blood I'm able to shift to the surface to try to release heat. So if we look at these two factors then, if I'm working with someone in an environment that is hot, then that best possibility of not developing heat stress symptoms will be pretty low body fat and high aerobic fitness. So if you're working with athletes who are outdoors athletes and you want them out in the heat, then that's what you've got to aim for. It's one of the interesting things with a football team, right? So if you look at the difference between a quarterback and the lineman, right? The linemen often say in their files, well, it's good to be fat because I want to be as heavy as possible. But if I'm taking my whole team out, then my linemen are at much more risk of having a problem than my quarterbacks are, because you don't see heavy quarterbacks. Quarterbacks are lean and fit. So there's a cultural situation there when you're looking at an entire football team. Culturally, it's acceptable for the linemen, is that right? The big guys, right? It's acceptable for them to be a little bit heavy, but now they're more likely to get sick. Okay? One of the problems we see when individuals are training and being active in the heat is that some people develop cramping that's due to the heat. So they often occur when the temperature is way above normal, but you sometimes see them in some individuals who are particularly susceptible, even at what we would consider a normal temperature and at normal body temperatures. So getting these heat cramps doesn't mean necessarily that my core temperature is high. Some people just seem to develop them just because they've been training in the heat, right? So dehydration is one of the reasons. There's quite a lot of factors that could play a role. Electrolyte imbalances, so if my sodium is a little bit off. Neuromuscular fatigue, so we've done a high volume of work at a high intensity and we see fatigue within the nervous system and the muscular system, right? So maybe ACH at the neuromuscular junction is depleted, and so it's all attached to the muscle membrane, so the muscle is continuing to contract even though it should be relaxing at that point. You can take some salt tablets if you're susceptible. Again, normally we have enough salt in our diet, although I have read, and I don't know how true it is, because I've never researched it, but I have read that sea salt is meant to do a better job than table salt. So if you're having trouble with cramping, then maybe switch your salt over to sea salt. It's not going to hurt, it's worth a try. Right? Intense exercise. Okay. And involuntary muscle contraction. So if you watch tennis, that's where I see it. You quite often in the summer see tennis players start to cramp. And if they're not able to overcome that, if their electrolyte drink doesn't do the job, or the intensity of the match is high, or it gets hotter, you quite often will see people literally doubled over and they have to carry them off the court. Right? It's really pretty bad. It's very unpleasant. It can occur at rest. So you might have part of your team doing drills, working really hard, and then you get them to go and take a water break while you do some work with another part of your group. The people on the water break, even though they're resting at that point, you may see heat cramp occur. Right? So it's not always while you're actually moving. It's the most common heat illness when you look at two-a-days when athletes first come back to school. During the first 3 weeks or so of your 2-a-day regime, heat cramps are the most common form of heat illness that we see. So some of you may have been there, I hope not, because they look really painful. All right, and then we have a kind of continuum, like we did when we were looking at the altitude sickness. We have a similar continuum when we look at heat illness, right? The one end of the continuum is syncope. Syncope is characterized by someone feeling faint or feeling dizzy, right? It can often occur either sitting or standing once I've been highly active in the heat. So then if I've been moving around a lot and then I sit down to have a rest, or I'm standing still to have a rest, right? One of the issues, I've done all this exercise, and so my body's response to the heat that I've created while I'm exercising is to dilate all the blood vessels at the surface level, right? So we get very red when we're exercising. We get even redder when we're exercising in the heat. Our arms may go red. You may get people that get red flashes across their back or down their legs, right? Because the body just dilates everything in an attempt to try to get rid of some of this heat. That then directs blood flow away from the core and makes it difficult to move that blood back to the heart. You also get a lot of pooling in your legs, right? So if I'm standing still or I'm sitting and I've been exercising a lot, then I see some pooling of the blood in the veins in the legs, which again reduces the amount of blood that's coming back to the atria in venous return. And then my stroke volume goes down, Q goes down, blood flow to the brain goes down, and so the brain starts to go, ooh, okay, what's going on? Okay. Of course, dehydration is going to play a role, because the more dehydrated I am, the lower my blood plasma will be, and then that impacts venous return as well. Right. And we may see brain ischemia, so actual damage to some of the brain tissue if this goes on for too long. Right. It's more common in individuals who are not acclimatized. So again, we've all been living here for a while. We're less likely to have this issue with a little bit of heat stress. But if you are recruiting in players that live somewhere cold, and you're going to bring them in the summer for pre-season training, you've got to give them time to acclimatize before you put them out on the field and exercise them. So either you need to fork out the money to bring them in early enough, right? Pay their rent, pay their food so that they can get ready for training. Or if you can't do that and you're going to bring them in right at the beginning of preseason, then you've got to be prepared to lower the intensity and the volume of work for the first few weeks of training for that person. Right? You have a choice, but you can't expect someone to come in from a cold environment to 100-degree weather and keep up with everybody else without getting sick. Something will give, right? So step 2 on the continuum then is heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion occurs when we're sweating a lot. It can be due to getting dehydrated. It could be losing sodium because we're sweating a lot. Or you might have an athlete that decides that they want to be healthy and so they stop adding salt to their food. All right, because there's a lot of information out in the media or just amongst people that would say, well, salt's bad for you. Not necessarily true. Okay? Depends upon the person. So for most people, salt isn't bad. Okay? So sodium loss leading to energy depletion. So there's a lot, and there's other factors as well. There's a lot of factors that play into the possibility of developing heat exhaustion. So it makes it a little bit tricky to diagnose because you may have someone who's drinking plenty of water, right? And yet they still develop heat exhaustion. So maybe they didn't eat enough calories the day before, or the same, for some reason the sodium is low. Typically, humidity plays a role, so we're less likely to see it in New Mexico than we are in the South. Doesn't mean you won't see it, but we're less likely to see it because the sweating and the dehydration and the sodium all comes with that water not evaporating. What they say, one of the biggest problems with heat exhaustion is that it appears from the outside to be similar to exertional heat stroke, which is our final piece of the pie. All right? So when I'm looking at heat exhaustion, core temperature can be anywhere from 97 to 104 degrees. So that's pretty high. Okay. Symptoms could be persistent cramping. You could have an athlete complaining of headaches. Watch their color, because again, with heat exhaustion, you start to see people looking paler when you would expect them to look very red because they're exercising in the heat, right? So if they're looking a bit pale and kind of washy and sweaty, then that's a big warning sign. They might be breathing faster than you expect them to, so they could be hyperventilating, right? That you would not expect given the work you just asked them to do. They could be complaining of feeling sick, right? Hopefully, they're not going to get to the stage where they're telling you that they've developed diarrhea because you would catch it before that happened. Right? Decreased urine output, it's a tricky one to identify because if we're exercising, we see lower urine outputs anyway. Right? So, what is too low? It's kind of hard to put your finger on when you're out in the field. The confusion with exertional heat stroke, though, is crucial because EHS can be lethal. And so the suggestion is if you're seeing symptoms and you don't have a way of taking someone's core temperature, you can use, they have those little skin temperature things now. Those aren't very accurate though. Core temperature, the best way is to use a rectal thermometer. You may not have that out on the field with you, right? So if you've got someone who's exhibiting some problems, don't assume it's heat exhaustion. Right? Because EHS is emergency scenario. Right? If we move on from heat exhaustion to exertional heat stroke, now that person's in real difficulty. So exertional heat stroke is again caused by a complete failure now of dissipating body heat when I'm exercising and I've been moving around at an intense level. So core temperature is going up above 105. Uh-oh, don't do that. Core temperature is going up above 105 or higher. Core temperatures of 109 degrees can be fatal. Right? And once you're on the slippery slope, once your core temperature is rising like that, then that's an indication that your body's systems for dissipating the heat are not working. So it's not going to come back down. It's going to keep going up if you don't remove that person from the heat. Okay? So it's one of the reasons why ice baths are so useful, and if you've got access to an ice bath, anyone that's exhibiting these symptoms should be put into cool water as soon as possible. Right? Let's see. Complications, if they don't die, right, which would be a good thing, complications can include, though, renal failure. Right? I can start to destroy muscle tissue at certain levels, may have bleeding problems. Okay. Everything just kind of goes awry. So what are the signs that you're looking for? Tachycardia, so now my heart rate is going slow. My blood pressure is dropping, so I'm going to feel, if I'm sitting down and I stand up, I'm going to feel really woozy. You may see confusion, or they may get angry when there's no reason to get angry. Some mental state could be bizarre, and it can lead to a seizure or to coma. So really the idea is get them cool as quickly as possible, whatever that takes. If all you've got is wet towels, get their clothes off and get wet towels on them. If you've got a cold shower nearby, get them in a cold shower. Preferably in a bath, because more of the body's surface area is in touch with the water in a bath than it is in the shower. Right? Or lay them down in the shower and put your foot over the plug hole or something. Get as much cold water on that person as you can and call 911. Sounds dramatic, and hopefully it would be their job. But the problem is that many of you are going to be working in situations where you don't have access to that level of knowledge and that help. Right? If you're in a high school, there's no requirement for high schools to have athletic trainers yet. So you might not have an athletic trainer on the field. It's your job to look for the symptom and then try to help this individual as quickly as possible. Okay. What do we see? Is it different between boys and girls? The literature doesn't suggest so, although having said that, boys typically are larger, right? So their body mass is higher, and so the amount of heat they're producing would be higher than for most girls. But once you take size, muscle mass, and all that into account, if you normalize the information, then it's nothing to do with sex. It's not girls versus boys, it's size. Right? So if you've got Sharapova with about 25 extra pounds on her, and she's what, 6'2", 6'3", then she's going to be just as at risk as a tall guy. Okay. Fitness level definitely does seem to play a role. So If I'm going to take my PE class out, is everybody in the class fit enough to cope with going out on a field trip at that time of the year? Or do I need to reschedule the field trip for when the temperatures cool down? That means then that if I'm going to be training in the heat, we should prioritize aerobic fitness over strength and flexibility. Not instead of strength and flexibility, but if I'm expecting my PE or my athletes to be exercising at that temperature, then I need to make sure that they're aerobically fit enough to cope with that. So, if you're on a good team with a good coach and a great strength and conditioning coach, part of your initial training program when you come back to school, having had a break up during the summer, is going to be a lot of aerobic conditioning. And we argue at different times in the semester, well, my sport isn't aerobic, so why am I doing aerobic work? Right? I'm an anaerobic athlete. I should be spending my time doing anaerobic work. But they have to get you fit enough to do the anaerobic work. Or they have to assume that you did your aerobic work that they gave you to do over the summer so that you came back fit enough to do your anaerobic work. I wouldn't trust you to do that if I was the coach. I would want to give you the aerobic work first. Okay? Age, unfortunately, as we get older, even if we stay active and we keep training, cardiovascular fitness does decline. Right? I can slow it down, so the harder I work, the more active I am as I get older, the less decline I see, but it's still going to go down. That's just the nature of the beast. So, a decline in cardiovascular function then means that my aerobic fitness is going down and now I'm not as capable of managing with the heat. So if you're working with an older population, they're going to struggle even more as it gets hotter than a student population would. Right. There is information that suggests that older individuals can acclimatize so they can improve their tolerance to the heat. But I don't think there's anything to indicate that you can just you're going to be okay in the heat. If I'm 75 and I'm trying to exercise in the heat, I'm not going to be as good at that as I was when I was 35. Right? I can train, but I have to start lowering intensity, lowering volume, and taking into account age. I hate to say that, but we need to do that. So, if you help your grandparents with some exercising, or as your parents get older, or as you get older, or if you go and work at a recreation centre where they have senior citizens come in during the day, then you have to take into account the fact that they're just not going to deal with being as hot outside as you are, right? Because they're a lot older than you. When we look at actual measures of performance, then when we're running or biking or doing any kind of aerobic, long duration aerobic work, the higher the temperature, the lower the performance outcome usually. So I slow down as it gets hotter and hotter. Not at 80, right, but at 100 degrees, we're looking at declines in performance. So get acclimatized first. If you are going to compete at World Championships and they're going to be somewhere super hot, go early, right? Proper hydration. So we've talked quite a lot recently about hydration status. Am I monitoring my hydration status? Am I making sure I have access to enough water and or electrolyte drink if I need it? And be as obviously fit as possible, which if you're going to be doing endurance events would be part of the job anyway. So if you're looking at high altitude as well as quite high temperatures, then even more careful with those hydration measures. If it's an anaerobic event, a power event or a strength event, then it seems to be less likely that you'll see a performance detriment if you manage your exposure to the heat properly. So, what's the duration of the event? That's the number one idea. And what's the duration of your heat exposure? So, for example, if I'm running a track and field meet, when we watch track and field, then a runner will finish their race and typically walk off the track, either back to the changing room or go over and sit in the stands. If, however, we pay attention to what's going on in the field event, so if I'm looking at the high jump people, they don't do a jump and then go all the way across the field, all the way across the track and into the changing room, and then come all the way back out again to do their next round. Right? They jump, they sit and wait. Same with a shot put or any of the throwing events. Right? So if we're looking at the people that are on the track with immediate access to the changing room, then their duration of heat exposure can actually be quite high, because even though the duration of the event is very short, they're sitting out there waiting for the next turn. So it's important then that we should make sure they have shade to sit in. So if I'm going to organize a track and field event during the summer or during a time of the year when it's warm, we should make sure that we have shade canopies set up for the athletes that have to stay out in the field. Also make sure there's buckets of ice and water out there so that they can stay hydrated and not have to come all the way back to the side to get water. Up to 800 meters, we don't see very much impact on the activity because it's limited exposure to the heat. I'm not out there. A good 800 meter runner doesn't take very long to run 800 meters. So they're in and out of the sun and the heat very quickly. 1500 meters though, a little bit more risky, so I might want to make sure that we have ice and things directly at the finish line so that we can start to get them cooled down as quickly as we can. So can I limit the exposure to the heat and the sun? Can I make sure that we provide adequate hydration opportunities? And even, you know what's really cool now, you can buy those little scarves, you know, and you can soak them in cold water and the crystals all expand and put those on. So if I've got a whole pile of those sitting ready, then when my shot putter is not throwing, they can come and sit down under a shade canopy with an ice towel or a neck tie. Okay. What am I going to do to make sure that I keep them healthy? Wet towel on the head. When I hike or when I ride in the summer, I always have a bandana and I soak it in cold water and put it on my head and then put my bike helmet on. Because you want to try and keep as cool as possible. Acclimation and acclimatization, the same thing. Depending where you're looking, they'll use those terms interchangeably, particularly if it's a PE journal or a coaching journal. Right? If you're looking at a physiology textbook, they're going to distinguish between the two because technically they're not the same. Acclimation means that you spend a lot of time training in a sauna in order to go and compete somewhere hot. Acclimatization means you went out early enough to adapt to the heat. So for the cardiovascular system to adapt, then my timeline is anywhere up to 5 days. Where are we? Time to go? All right, we'll finish that off on Friday. So Friday we'll finish just a couple more points on activity in the heat, and then we'll look at activity in the cold. There's not a lot of information when we're looking at the cold and adaptation and things like that.